Hey guys, welcome to today's video. Previously, we learned how to develop a basic API in Django REST framework. More specifically, you learned how to use functional programming in Django REST framework. This time, we'll be taking our REST framework skills to the next level. In this video, you'll be learning how to use class-based views. More specifically, you'll be learning how to refactor your functional code into classes, API views, and mixins. So let's get started. So recall in a previous video, you learned how to use functions to create endpoints. As discussed before, we'll be using classes instead. To start with, what I'll do here is I create a new file and I'll call it classviews.py. So here, let's now create a class-based view. To start with, first I'll go REST framework.views. I import my API view class, and then I'll also import my response module. So REST framework.response import response. So I need to fix my code here. So from, let's now create a class. So for example, I'll call my endpoint class view, and then it will inherit from the API view class. So this is where we define our methods. So for example, in a class-based view, if I want to create a get method, so I can simply go def get and then self comma request, and then I return a response. So in this case, return response and then whatever Copilot tells me. So similarly, or to handle a post request, I can simply create a post function. So of course, now I need to link this class view to my API. To do so, I go to urls.py. So to start with, I will import my class view. So from import class views, and then I scroll down, comma path, let's call it class, comma, and then class views dot class view dot as view. That's it. Let's now test out our code. To run my project, I can simply navigate to Django tutorial folder and then python manage.py run server. Let's now test it out. So here, as you see, I defined a class endpoint. So within my API URL, I can do class and then I run it. As you can see, our code worked. Recall earlier that I've also defined a post request. So post class. Great. Let's now move on. So in a previous video, we created get, post, put, and delete requests to insert or remove or update stuff from our database. We'll do the same thing using class views. So I'll go back to classviews.py, and then here I'll create another class. I'll call it class item list view. So just like before, it will inherit from API view. So first of all, I want to create a get request. So def get self request, and then basically I copy all of my code from my function, and then I paste it here. Let's now fix our indentation, and then fix our imports also. So from models import item, and then from serializers import item serializer dot. One thing I need to fix here, I need to change JSON response as just response. And then my next step should be to create a post request. So def post, and I basically get to copy the same thing from my corresponding post request. So data and everything. Let's now fix the indentation. So of course, I need to import JSON parser as well. So from REST framework parsers, import JSON parser. And of course, now the next step should be to link my item list view to my urls.py file. So I'll go back to urls.py path class, let's call it /items, comma class views dot item list view as view. Let's now test this out. So class /items, and if I do a get, as you can see, I have an error, which means I need to fix some of my code. I go back to class views.py file, and apparently the error I'm getting is that the safe keyword argument was not needed. So then I'll remove it like so. Let's now go back and see if it works. So get and then send. So as you can see, our code now works. What if we do a post request? I have my JSON body. Let's change it to, I don't know, Apple post. Okay, it's now been added. Now let's do a get and see if it's already there. Cool. Let's now move on. So of course, a couple more things we added in our functional based view was put and delete requests. So let's add it now. So to handle my put and delete requests, I will create another API view. So let's call it class item detail view, which inherits from API view. Here we get to create a function. So def get object self ID. So basically what I want my function to do is whatever ID I get in my parameter, in my URL parameter, this function attempts to get my database item with the corresponding ID. To make this happen, we can go try and then return item.objects.get and then with the corresponding ID. If it doesn't exist, which means except item does not exist, I return none. Let's now move on. Now I'll define a specific get request first. So def get self request and then the URL parameter, which in this case is my ID. So I call it ID and then self dot the get object function of ID. If my ID does not exist, I can return a 404. Otherwise, if it does exist, I can serialize that item and then return it as response. So using this get method, I get to check if this class API view works properly. So let's now link it to my urls.py file. So urls.py and then path class items and then my ID parameter will be handled by the item detail view class. Let's now test this out. So to test this out, I'll pick the item with the ID of 2. So /2. So as a response, I'm getting an error. Let's now fix our code. If I go back to class views.py and basically the error is here, it should be objects.get. Let's now go back and then send. Great. As you can see, our code works. Let's now go back to handle our put and delete request. So of course it's basically the same. So def put self request ID. So first I get the item with the corresponding ID and then I save it in my item variable. If it does not exist, I return a 404. Otherwise, if it does exist, I'll parse the user's request and then return it as a response. Let's now double check GitHub Copilot's code. Okay, so far it looks good. Let's now test this out. So if I make a put request and I change the name to, for example, I don't know, Linux maybe. Okay, so it's been updated. Let's now do a get request. So I expect an item with the ID of 2 should have the name Linux. Send. Great. It now works. Let's now handle our delete request. So def delete and then basically the same thing. So if an item exists, I delete it. Otherwise, the client gets a 404. So delete, and I want to delete the item with the ID of 2. Send. It's been deleted. Now let's do a get. We should expect a 404. Let's now move on. What if I tell you we can make all of this code even shorter? How do we do this? This is where mixins come in. So basically, most of the code we've written for performing all of our CRUD operations are already implemented within Django REST framework. Let's now implement a mixin. So here, within my API folder, I create a new file called mixin-views.py. So first of all, I need to create my mixin. So class item list mixin is what I'll call it, and it will inherit from a series of classes. So mixin.list model mixin, which means that this view will list items from our database, comma mixin.create model mixin, which means that it will insert items into the database. And then lastly, since it will be an API, it will be generics.generic API view. And let's now see what GitHub Copilot has suggested for us. So of course, when we create a mixin, we have to define a query set variable. So what's a query set variable, you might ask? So query sets are basically the list of all items or our database models that we want to display. In this case, we want to display all the items from our database. The next variable will be the serializer class, which means, as the name suggests, how would this API view serialize the response? And now, of course, I need to fix my imports. So from .models import item, and then from serializers I import my item serializer, and then basically these modules, so mixin and generic. So Copilot has also suggested more code for us. Let's double check it. This get method or this get function basically says that this mixin API view will also handle a get request, and it has a list function which is coming from this class, and it basically says that it wants to list items from the database which is coming from the query set. The post, as the name suggests, it will create items which is coming from the create model mixin class, and it will insert items into the database. Of course, I need to link this file or my API mixin class with the urls.py module. So going down to path, and I'll call it mixin/items and mixin views dot, let's go back, item list mixin as view. Now I need to fix my imports. I need to import my mixin view. So from dot, I import mixin views. Here I'm getting another error. I need to call it mixins. Now I need to fix it like so, mixins and then mixins. Let's now test this out. So here mixins or mixin/items. Cool. As you can see, our code works. Let's now test our post function, then send. So we have a new item. Let's now get again to see if everything's working fine. Let's now re-implement our put and delete requests using mixins. So I go back. So within my mixin-views.py file, I create a class item detail mixin, and then GitHub Copilot has already suggested a code for us. So let's double check it. So first things first, it's inheriting from the retrieve model mixin class, which as the name suggests, it retrieves a certain item from a database. Next, it implements from the update model mixin class, which means, as the name suggests, it will update certain items in the database. Then it will also implement a few functions responsible for destroying items from the database. And then since it's a generic API view, this means that this class will be an API view. So of course, first things first, we have to define a query set and then a serializer class. Get, and this time it has used the retrieve function to retrieve items from our database or a certain item from our database. And then put, which will update, and then destroy. Let's now save it and then hook this view with our URLs file. So path and then mixin items. In this case, to keep it consistent, I'll call it ID. Let's now test this out. So I'm mixing with a certain, let's say 3. So as you can see here, we've got an error. And I know exactly why. Going back into our code, let's go to mixin-views.py file. So one thing to remember is that mixin-view by default looks at the pk URL parameter. So if this was pk, it would mean that this code would work fine. But we want it to be an ID. So how do we fix this? We go back to mixin-views and then change another variable or define a variable called lookup field and set it to ID. Now it should work just fine. Going back, and then if I send again, it should work. If I do 5, nice. As you can see, our code works. For the sake of brevity, I won't really be testing all the other methods. Okay, that's it for mixins. But what if I tell you this code could be made even shorter? How do we do this? This is where generics come in. So as documentation suggests, generic views already contain a set of built-in functions that already implement our get, put, delete, or other requests. Let's see how it works. So going back to my code here, I'll create another file, and this time I'll call it generics.py. Let's create a generic view. So class item list generic view. It will inherit from the generics.list create API view. So basically this means that this view will be responsible for only listing and creating items from the database, which is basically similar to the item list mixin class. As you can see here, this class basically inherits from list model mixin and create model mixin. Generics have basically allowed you to mix both of these classes within one class. Let's now move on. So of course, now I need to fix my imports. So from .models, I import my item, and then from serializer, I import item serializer. And of course, now I need to import generics. That's it. Of course, now my last step should be to hook this view with my URL.py file. So here I call it path generic/items. So generics.item list generic view as view. Now of course I need to fix my imports. I scroll up from .import generics. That's it. Let's now test this code out. So generics/items. As you can see, this code basically works. So notice how much code we managed to shave off using the generic view class. Okay, moving forward now, of course, I need to implement my item details view. So item detail generic view. So as GitHub Copilot suggested, this view will be responsible for retrieving, updating, or destroying items from the database. So this time I'll say query set and then items objects dot all and then my serializer class. That's it. Now let's save it and then link this. So path generics/items and then ID item detail generic view. Let's now test this out. Going back to my API client, if I do items/2, so I get an error here. Let's now fix it. According to the console, I need to set up my lookup field parameter or my variable. So within generics.py, I set my lookup field to ID. Let's now test this again. Okay. So basically I have a 404. What if I do an item of 5, which I know exists, an item of 5? And let's do a put and let's change it to Mac OS. Okay, and then if I do a get, we should expect it to work. Nice. Now here in this case, notice I managed to shave off more than 20 lines of code using generics. That's it for today. If you guys have any questions, let me know in the comment section. Till then, bye bye.